As a new legal saga unfolds in the United States, a Canadian man's 15-year legal battle has entered a new phase in France.
It's, a continuing nightmare.
On Monday, France's top court put Hassan Diab on trial in connection with a 43-year-old bombing attack outside a Paris synagogue. This trial comes 5 years after a lower court set Diab free due to a lack of evidence. Diab stands accused of murder in the 1980 Rue Copernic bombing, which killed 4 people and injured more than 40. Diab is a sociologist who is now 69 years old. The RCMP arrested him in November 2008, and Diab was placed under strict bail conditions until he was extradited to France in 2014. He spent more than 3 years in prison in France before the case against him collapsed. He was released in January 2018 after 2 French judges ruled the evidence against him wasn't strong enough to take to trial. He was never formally charged.
Justice has finally prevailed.
The key physical evidence Canada relied on in extraditing Diab to France was handwriting analysis linking Diab's handwriting to that of the suspected bomber. The French judges dismissed the handwriting evidence as unreliable when they ordered Diab's release. Those same judges also found that Diab had an alibi for the day of the Paris bombing. University records and interviews with Diab's classmates determined he was probably in Lebanon writing exams when the bombing outside the synagogue took place. French prosecutors appealed Diab's release, pursuing it long after the last remaining piece of physical evidence linking him to the bombing had been discredited by France's own experts. But in 2021, prosecutors won the appeal, and this week the trial started. Diab's supporters have been urging the Prime Minister to publicly refuse any future extradition requests to France, urging him to make good on these comments from 2018.
We have to recognize, first of all, that what happened to him never should have happened. This is something that obviously was an extremely difficult situation to go through for himself, for his family, and that's why we've asked for an independent external review to look into exactly how this happened and make sure that it never happens again.
Don Bayne represented Hassan Diab throughout his extradition fight, and he joins me now in the studio. Don Bayne, good to see you again.
Thank you.
How worried are you now that France has decided to go ahead with this trial?
It's a trial, that the French themselves, the professional investigators, said should not be taking place. When Hassan was extradited, 2 professional investigative judges spent 3 years collecting and assessing the evidence. And they concluded not only was there insufficient reliable evidence in France to put this man on trial, but there was powerful, credible evidence from the university that Dr. Diab was in fact in Beirut when this bombing was going on in Paris. And they ruled that, and they ordered that Dr. Diab be returned to Canada. However, a political lobby of a number of groups campaigned for a trial. There are journalists there in tabloids campaigning for a trial, some of whom will be witnesses at the trial tomorrow. That's the type of trial this is. So it's very much a political trial. The court that ordered the trial to go ahead said the victims deserve a trial. What they don't deserve is a scapegoat or a miscarriage of justice. That's where we stand now. There's a trial going on that the French themselves said should not be taking place.
Well, I want to touch on that because the weaknesses of the French case, right? The handwriting that was used as the basis for the extradition has been discredited in all of the analysis and all of the forms that were done. There is this alibi of him being in Beirut on the day the bomb went off. There was a failure to disclose fingerprint evidence to Canadian authorities because all the fingerprints they found in the investigation, not a single match with Hassan Diab. So given the fact that the evidence was weak to begin with and has gotten weaker over time, are you still worried that this could lead to a conviction given the nature of the concerns you've outlined?
Absolutely. What's at stake here is the wrongful conviction of a Canadian citizen. I've looked at this list, projected list of witnesses. Not only are 4 tabloid journalists giving evidence tomorrow, and I ask myself, what can journalists, as discreditable as the occupation is, they have no direct evidence to give except they've been campaigning for a conviction. And then the two handwriting experts that were discredited in Canada who relied on the wrong person's comparison handwriting, they're testifying tomorrow.
Right, because the initial handwriting evidence was an assessment not of Hassan Diab's handwriting, but of his ex-wife's handwriting.
That's right.
And they said this was a match for the bomber, and it wasn't even his pen.
Remember, the bomber was described as a 40-year-old man, and they identified that 40-year-old man as being Hassan's ex-wife.
Right.
They're testifying too. So there's a spate of unreliable witnesses. There are journalists. There is secret intelligence that is unsourced. The French don't even know where it comes from. It's just bald allegations that would find no place in a Canadian courtroom.
Now, the French have a different judicial system. They conduct their trials in a different way than we do here in Canada. So even with these concerns you've highlighted, do you think he can get a fair trial and a fair outcome under the structure that they operate in France?
Hope springs eternal that the president of this court will see through this charade and that he will not be convicted. But believe me, he and his family and I are deeply concerned that there'll be a wrongful conviction here because there's been such a campaign to find somebody, anybody responsible for this 1980 bombing. And you know, if we get a wrongful conviction, it'll be followed again by a wrongful extradition. We've already had one. And it's interesting, in the time period that Hassan has been back, France was asked by Canada to extradite a French priest accused of sexually molesting numerous young Indigenous children. And France refused, saying, oh, it's too long ago and we don't extradite our citizens. Yet France expects Canada to comply with an extradition request following a wrongful conviction.
And those sexual offenses this priest is accused of having committed are roughly in the same time period as this bombing, right, within a couple of years. You know, it's interesting, I was reading some of the coverage, and one of the French prosecutors on Monday suggested it was cowardly that Hassan Diab wasn't in Paris in person, that he'd refused an invitation to come and stand trial in person and instead is being tried in absentia. What do you make of comments like that?
That shows the stridency of the prosecutors. I can say as well, the Advocate General of France opposed this trial. There are voices in France of reason saying, no, this shouldn't be going ahead. And then there are the kind of noisy voices that have been clamoring to find somebody guilty.
It's been about 5 years, I think, since I started covering this story, but it's been going on for 15 years. Hassan is not speaking publicly right now because of everything. I mean, how is he? How are him and his family doing? They were so joyful when he came home. They thought this was over, and yet here they are again. How is Hassan Diab doing today?
Well, they've had the sword of Damocles hanging over them for years now. It's actually happening now. I talk to Hassan daily. He can't sleep. His children are being protected as much as they can. They're fearful that their dad will be gone again. It's a terrible strain on the family.
And no assurances from the federal government on extradition. The request has been made to publicly refuse to even consider another extradition request. Nothing on that?
Well, there's two things. One, the Prime Minister's words that, you know, what happened to this man, the wrongful extradition in the first place, should never be allowed to happen again. But the government hasn't stepped forward to say, we don't care what you do in this trial. We're aware that your investigators said there's no evidence to justify a trial, and we're not going to extradite this man a second time. The other thing I noticed was in the Globe yesterday, there was a report that Canadian officials will closely follow the proceedings. Hassan showed me yesterday a letter from consular officials in Paris saying, we will not attend the trial.
Right. They'll monitor it, but they won't be in the courtroom.
They won't, yeah.
All right, Don Bayne, thanks for coming in, and we'll have you back if there's any updates.
Thank you, David.